Even though today's mobile devices are very powerful, there's a lot more power in this Android smartphone today than there was to send people to the moon back in 1969. However, there are still some constraints that are related to the power or the lack thereof compared to a full-fledged desktop computer that we have to think about, and those constraints are related to security. Now, one is CPU power. The CPU power in a mobile device is not nearly what it could be in a server-class piece of hardware or a high-end laptop or desktop. Now, why is that important? Well, it means that when it comes to cryptography, encrypting, decrypting, generating digital signatures or hashes and verifying them, all that crypto stuff Mike was talking about in Chapter 2, that is very computationally expensive. It takes a lot of CPU cycles. If you don't have a lot of CPU cycles, you're limited in what you can do with crypto. And that's the point when it comes to mobile devices. But luckily, we've got a way to deal with it. In Chapter 2, Mike introduced you to elliptic curve cryptography, otherwise called ECC. ECC crypto can use a much smaller encryption key than you might use, say, with RSA keys, but it results in the same cryptographic strength. That means if it's a smaller key, it's less computations. Therefore, it works very well on mobile devices. Now, the other thing to think about on a mobile device is battery life. The battery only lasts so long, and the more computations you do, the more you're chewing up power from that battery. So the shorter the span of time you can use your device before charging it again. The other thing is limited transmission range when it comes to wireless. Now, if you have a laptop computer plugged into a wired network, you can connect to anything in the world that's also connected, for example, to the internet. But we have limited range when it comes to working with mobile devices. Now, in some cases, you might need to install an app on a mobile device legitimately that requires full elevated privileges on that device, whether it's an Apple iOS device or an Android-based device. So when we break into, and I say break into meaning all we're doing is changing the device so that we have full unfettered access to it, which can void your carrier's policy. So be careful, don't just do this randomly. But when you do that on an Android, it's called rooting. It's called rooting because Android uses a version of a Linux operating system where root is the super account. So by rooting a phone, it implies it's Android and it means you have full access to it. Why would you need that? Well, you might want to actually download a different version of the firmware operating system on your phone instead of going through the normal channels to do that, to apply updates. Or maybe you want to run an app that requires full access to every capability in the phone. You have more control when you root an Android phone. Now, on the Apple iOS side, if you're doing the same type of thing, it's not called rooting, it's just a different term. It's called jailbreaking. But it really is the same thing, and you would do it for the same types of reasons. Now, many organizations will have policies in place that prohibit this from happening for security reasons. Because if you root or jailbreak a phone, and then you install an app, a nefarious app, or your phone gets infected, it too would have full unfettered access to that device, which could spell trouble. Now remember, when we talked about IoT devices, one of the problems potentially is that you can't even apply updates to the IoT device, firmware updates, because the vendor might not even make them available. That's another type of constraint at the security side of things that relates to those types of devices. In the same way, some of those same types of IoT devices might also not allow you to change default settings. An example of this would be a baby monitor with an embedded HTTP web server that is hard-coded with a username and password to connect to the management page of that device that you can't change. That's absolutely crazy, but there are some devices that are like that. So what do we do when we have mobile devices that have constraints that are unacceptable, they don't adhere to organizational security standards? You either have to upgrade the device or perhaps isolate it on its own VLAN. So if we take a look at the diagram, here we might have a separate VLAN which is used solely for IoT devices compared to our production VLAN, which is separate. And we would have a strict firewall policy between those VLANs to limit traffic flow. The idea is that if we get a compromised IoT device, that can't be translated into getting into the production VLAN from an attacker's perspective.